"It's not a welcoming place," said Sir Henry, and his voice shook as he spoke. As we got closer, we could see that the hall was a heavy, dark building with a large main entrance. Most of the building was old and was covered in dark green ivy, but some of it had been built more recently and was of grim black stone. A dull light shone through the heavy windows. Black smoke was coming from one of the high chimneys of the main building. "Welcome, Sir Henry. Welcome to Baskerville Hall." Barrymore, the butler, and his wife were waiting on the steps at the main entrance. They came down and took our suitcases into the house. Dr. Mortimer left us to go home, and we went into the hall where a fire was burning. It was a fine room, large and high. "It's exactly as I imagined an old family home," Sir Henry said. Barrymore showed us to our rooms. He was a tall, handsome man, with a full black beard. After we had washed and changed our clothes, he brought our dinner. The dining room was not very welcoming. It needed more lights to make it brighter. On the walls were the pictures of the Baskervilles of the past. They looked down on us silently, and did nothing to make us feel happier. After dinner we went to our rooms. Before I got into bed, I looked out of my window. A strong wind sang sadly as it bent the trees in front of the hall. A half-moon shone through the dark flying clouds onto the wild and empty moor. I could not sleep. Then suddenly, in the middle of the night, I heard very clearly the sound of a woman crying. It was the crying of a person who was hurt by some deep sadness. The sound was not far away, and was certainly in the house. Chapter 8. The Stapletons of Pen House. The next morning was sunny, and we were much more cheerful. I told Sir Henry about the crying I had heard. He rang the bell to call Barrymore, and asked him if he could explain the crying. Barrymore's face went white when he heard Sir Henry's question. "There are only two women in the house, Sir Henry," he answered. "One is the maid, who sleeps on the other side of the house. The other is my wife, and she was certainly not crying." But he was telling a lie. I saw Mrs. Barrymore after breakfast. The sun was full on her face, and it was clear she had been crying. Why had Barrymore lied? What deep sadness had made his wife cry? There was a mystery surrounding this black-bearded, handsome man. Was it possible that Barrymore was in fact the man who had been watching Sir Henry in London? I decided I must check with the local post office that the telegram had really been put into Barrymore's own hands. While Sir Henry worked at some papers, I walked to the post office. It was in the nearest village, which was called Grimpen. I spoke to the boy who had taken the telegram to the hall. "Did you give it to Mr. Barrymore himself?" I asked. "Well," the boy said, "he was working up on the roof, so I couldn't give it to him. I gave it to Mrs. Barrymore, and she promised to give it to him at once." "Did you see Mr. Barrymore?" I asked him. "No," said the boy. "But why did his wife say he was up on the roof if he wasn't?" It was hopeless to ask any more questions. It was clear that Holmes's cleverness with a telegram had not given us the proof we needed. I was walking away from the post office when I heard someone running after me. A voice called me by name, and I turned. I expected to see Dr. Mortimer, as I knew nobody else in the village. To my surprise, it was a stranger. He was a small, thin man, between 30 and 40 years old, with fair hair and no beard. He was carrying a butterfly net and a box for putting butterflies in. "I hope you will excuse me for introducing myself, Dr. Watson," he said as he came up to me. "My name is Stapleton. I was in Dr. Mortimer's house, and we saw you. He told me who you are. May I walk along with you? This path back to the hall goes near my home, Penn House. Please come in and meet my sister, and spend an hour with us." I accepted Stapleton's invitation, and we walked together. "I know that you are a close friend of Sherlock Holmes," said Stapleton. "Has Mr. Holmes any ideas about Sir Charles's death?" "I'm afraid I can't answer that question," I said. "Will Mr. Holmes visit us himself?" he asked. "He can't leave London at the moment," I answered. I was rather surprised that he was asking me these questions. We walked on. Stapleton told me that he and his sister had lived in Devonshire for only 2 years. They had moved there soon after Sir Charles had begun to live in Baskerville Hall. He also talked about the moor and how it interested him. He told me to look across the moor to a place which was a bright green colour. "That is the Great Grimpen Marsh," he said. "If animals or men go into the marsh, they will sink into it and die. But I can find my way to the very centre of it. Look, there is another of those poor horses." Something brown was fighting to get out of the bright green of the marsh. Then a terrible cry came across the moor. The horse's head and neck disappeared under the green. "It's gone," Stapleton said. "The marsh has caught and killed it. That often happens. It is an evil place, the Great Grimpen Marsh." "But you say you can go safely in and out of it," I asked him. "Yes. There are a few paths, and I have found them. The low hills you can see are like islands surrounded by the marsh. That is where I can find the unusual plants and butterflies. And that's why I found my way through the marsh." "I shall try my luck one day," I said. He looked at me in surprise. "Please don't try," he said. "You would never return alive, and it would be my fault." "Listen," I said. "What is that?" A long, low cry, very deep and very sad, came over the moor. It filled the whole air. Then it died away. "What is it?" I asked, with a cold fear in my heart. Stapleton had a strange look on his face. "The people say it's the hound of the Baskervilles, which is calling for something to hunt and kill. I've heard it once or twice before, but never so loud." "You are a man of science," I said. "You don't believe that, do you? Isn't there a natural explanation for the sound?" "A marsh makes strange noises sometimes. It is the water and the wet ground moving." "But that was the voice of a living creature," I said.
"Well, perhaps it was. There are some very unusual birds on the moors. It was most probably the cry of one of those."
At that moment a small butterfly flew across the path in front of us.
"Excuse me, Dr. Watson,"
shouted Stapleton, and ran off to try to catch the butterfly. He ran quickly and followed the butterfly onto the marsh, but he knew exactly where he could go, and was not in any danger. As I watched him, I heard the sound of steps behind me. I turned and saw a woman near me on the path. I was sure she was Miss Stapleton. She was very beautiful. She was dark and tall, with a lovely face. Before I could say anything, she said, "Go back. Go straight back to London immediately. I cannot tell you why, but please do what I ask you, and never come near the moor again. But my brother is coming. Not a word to him." Stapleton had caught the butterfly, and was walking back to us.
"Hello, my dear,"
he said to his sister, but it seemed to me that his voice was not completely friendly.
I see that you two have already introduced yourselves."
"Yes," she said. "I was telling Sir Henry that it was rather late in the year for him to see the true beauty of the moor." "I am sorry," I said. "You have made a mistake. I am not Sir Henry. I am a friend who is visiting him, and my name is Dr. Watson." Miss Stapleton was clearly angry with herself. "I'm sorry," she said. "Please forget what I said. But do come with us to our house." The house was lonely and rather grim. I wondered why the two of them had come to live so far away from anyone else. Stapleton seemed to know what I was thinking, and said, "You may think this is a lonely, strange place to live, but the moors are very interesting, and we enjoy it here. I owned a school in the north of England, but I had to close it. I miss the boys and girls, but there is plenty to do here, and we have good neighbours. I hope Sir Henry will become one of them. May I visit the Hall this afternoon to meet him, do you think?" "I am sure he will be very pleased to meet you," I said. "I must go back to the Hall now, and I shall tell him immediately." I said good-bye to the Stapletons, and continued on the path back to the Hall. I had been walking for only a few minutes when I was surprised to see Miss Stapleton sitting on a rock ahead of me. She was breathing quickly, and I realized she had run by a quicker way to get ahead of me. "Dr. Watson," she said, "I want to say sorry for the mistake I made. I thought you were Sir Henry. Please forget what I said. I did not mean you were in danger. Now, I must go, or my brother will miss me." "I cannot forget your words, Miss Stapleton," I said. "If Sir Henry is in danger, I must tell him." "You know the story of the hound?" she asked me. "Yes, but I do not believe it," I replied. "But I think it's true," she said. "Please persuade Sir Henry to leave this place. So many of his family have died here mysteriously. He must not put his life in danger by staying here." "Sir Henry won't leave this place without a real reason," I said. "I can't give you a real reason. I don't know anything for certain." "One more question, Miss Stapleton," I said. "The story of the hound is well known. Why didn't you want your brother to hear what you said?" "My brother wants the head of the Baskerville family to live in the Hall," she said. "He wants Sir Henry to continue the good work that Sir Charles began. He doesn't want Sir Henry to go and live in another place. So he doesn't want me to talk about the hound. I must go now, or my brother will guess I have been speaking to you. Goodbye." She turned and went back towards her house, and I walked on to Baskerville Hall. Chapter 9. The Escaped Prisoner. Mr. Stapleton came to the Hall and met Sir Henry that same afternoon. The next morning he took us to the place where the evil Sir Hugo died. Then we had lunch at Penn House. Sir Henry clearly thought Miss Stapleton was very beautiful. His eyes followed her everywhere. He liked her very much, and I was sure that she felt the same about him. He spoke about her again and again as we walked home. After the first meeting, we met the Stapletons almost every day. After a short time, it was clear that Sir Henry had fallen deeply in love with the beautiful Miss Stapleton. At first I thought that Stapleton would be very pleased if his sister married Sir Henry. However, I soon realized that he did not want their friendship to grow into love. He did everything he could to make sure that they were never alone. On 1 or 2 occasions they did manage to meet alone, but Stapleton followed them and was not pleased to see them together. I soon met another neighbour of Sir Henry's. His name was Mr. Frankland, and he lived about 4 miles to the south of the Hall. He was an old man with a red face and white hair. He had 2 hobbies. The first was arguing. He argued with everybody. The second hobby was studying the stars. For this he had a very big telescope. For several days he had been watching the moor through the telescope. He wanted to find Selden, the escaped murderer. Nobody had seen the prisoner for a fortnight, and we all thought that he had probably left the moor. A few nights later I was woken by a noise at about 2 in the morning. I heard someone walking softly outside my door. I got up, opened the door, and looked out. I saw Barrymore moving carefully and quietly away from me. I followed him as quietly as I could. He went into one of the empty bedrooms and left the door open. I went quietly up to the door and looked inside. Barrymore was standing at the window. He was holding a light in his hand and looking out onto the moor. He stood without moving for a few minutes, and then he put out the light. I went quickly back to my room. A few minutes later, I heard Barrymore go softly by. The next morning I told Sir Henry what I had seen.
"We must follow him and find out what he is doing," said Sir Henry. "He won't hear us if we move carefully."
That night we sat in Sir Henry's room and waited. At about 3 o'clock in the morning we heard the sound of footsteps outside the bedroom. We looked out and saw Barrymore. We followed him as quietly as we could. He went into the same room as before. We reached the door and looked in. There was Barrymore, with the light in his hand, looking out across the moor, exactly as I had seen him on the night before. Sir Henry walked into the room and said, "What are you doing here, Barrymore?" Barrymore turned round quickly, surprise and horror on his face. "Nothing, sir," he said. The shadows on the wall from his light were jumping up and down as his hand shook. "It was the window, sir. I go round at night to see that they are closed, and this one wasn't shut."
"Come now, Barrymore," said Sir Henry. "No lies. What were you doing with that light? You were holding it up to the window."
I suddenly had an idea. "I think he was sending a message," I said. "Let's see if there's an answer from someone on the moor." I held the light up to the window and looked out into the darkness. Suddenly a light answered from the moor. "There it is!" I cried. I waved my light backwards and forwards across the window. The light on the moor answered by moving in the same way. "Now, Barrymore, who is your friend on the moor? What's going on?" "That's my business," said Barrymore. "I won't tell you."
"Are you making some criminal plan against me?" Sir Henry said.
"No, it's nothing against you, sir," said a voice from behind us. It was Mrs. Barrymore. She had followed us and was standing at the door. "He's doing it for me. My unhappy brother is cold and hungry on the moor. We cannot let him die. Our light is to tell him that food is ready for him. His light shows us where to take it."
"Then your brother is—"
began Sir Henry. "The escaped prisoner, sir. Selden, the murderer. He is my younger brother. He has done evil things, but to me he is still the little boy I loved and cared for. I had to help him. Everything my husband has done has been for me. Please don't take his job from him. It's not his fault." Sir Henry turned to Barrymore and said,
"I cannot blame you for helping your wife. Go to bed, and we'll talk about this in the morning."
The Barrymores left us.
"The murderer is waiting out there by that light," said Sir Henry. "He's a danger to everyone. I'm going to catch him. If you want to come with me, Watson, fetch your revolver, and let's go." We left the hall immediately.
"We must surprise him and catch him," said Sir Henry. "He's a dangerous man. Now, Watson, what would Holmes say about this? Do you remember what the old papers said? They said the devil does his work when the world is dark." Just as he spoke there came a strange cry from across the moor. It was the same cry I had heard when I was with Stapleton on the edge of the great Grimpen Marsh. "What is that noise?" asked Sir Henry. He stopped and put his hand on my arm to hold me back. "I've heard it before," I said. "Stapleton says it's the cry of a bird." "Watson," said Sir Henry, his voice shaking, "it is the cry of a hound." "What do the local people say it is?" "They say it is the cry of the hound of the Baskervilles," I replied. "Can there possibly be some truth in the story?" said Sir Henry. "Am I really in danger from such an evil thing? I think I am as brave as most men, but that sound froze my blood. But we have come out to catch that prisoner, and the devil himself will not make me turn back." It was difficult to cross the moor in the dark, but at last we reached the light. It was standing on a rock. Suddenly an evil face, more like an animal than a man, looked at us from behind the rock. The escaped prisoner saw us and screamed as he turned to run. Sir Henry and I were both good runners and very healthy men, but we soon realized that we had no chance of catching Selden. He knew the way and was running for his life. Soon we had lost him in the dark, so we stopped and sat down, breathing heavily, to rest. At that moment, a very strange thing happened. The moon was low upon our right, and in its light we could see the top of a hill. On that hill, with the moon behind him, stood a tall, thin man. He was standing perfectly still. He was watching us. It was not Selden, who had been running away from that hill. This man was much taller. With a cry of surprise, I turned to Sir Henry. As I turned, the man disappeared. I wanted to go across to the hill and search for him, but we were tired, and I remembered that Sir Henry might be in danger. So we went back to Baskerville Hall. Who was the tall man I had seen standing against the moon? Was he an enemy or a friend who was watching over us? I wished more and more that Holmes could leave London and come to Baskerville Hall. I wrote to him every few days, and gave him the details of everything that happened and everyone I met. Chapter 10. The Letter. The following day was dull and foggy. The hall was surrounded by heavy, low clouds, which opened now and then to show the grim, cold moor and its wet grey rocks. The weather made us miserable. It was difficult to be cheerful when we felt danger all around us. I thought of Sir Charles's death, and the awful sound of the hound, which I had now heard twice. Holmes did not believe that there was a supernatural hound, but facts are facts, and I had heard a hound. Was there a huge hound living on the moor? If so, where could it hide? Where did it get its food? Why was it never seen by day? It was almost as difficult to accept a natural explanation as a supernatural explanation. That morning Sir Henry and Barrymore argued about Selden, the escaped prisoner. Barrymore said that it was wrong to try to catch Selden. "But the man is dangerous," said Sir Henry. "He'll do anything. Nobody is safe until he is in prison again. We must tell the police." "I promise he won't break into any house," said Barrymore, "and he won't cause any trouble. In a few days he will catch a boat for South America. Please don't tell the police about him.
If you tell the police, my wife and I will be in serious trouble." "What do you say, Watson?" asked Sir Henry, turning to me.
"I don't think he will break into houses or cause trouble. If he did, the police would know where to look for him and would catch him. He's not a stupid man."
"I hope you're right," said Sir Henry. "I'm sure we're breaking the law. But I don't want to get Barrymore and his wife into trouble, so I shall not tell the police. I shall leave Selden in peace."
Barrymore could not find the words to thank Sir Henry enough. Then he said,
"You have been so kind to us that I want to do something for you in return. I have never told anyone else. I know something more about poor Sir Charles's death."
Sir Henry and I jumped up at once.
"Do you know how he died?"
Sir Henry asked.
"No, sir, I don't know that. But I know why he was waiting at the gate. He was going to meet a woman." "Sir Charles was meeting a woman? Who was the woman?" "I don't know her name," Barrymore said, "but it begins with L.L.
"How do you know this, Barrymore?" I asked.
"Well, Sir Charles got a letter on the morning of the day he died. It was from Newtown, and the address was in a woman's writing. I forgot all about it, but some time after Sir Charles died, my wife was cleaning the fireplace in his study. She found a letter. Most of it was burned, but the bottom of one page was not burned. On it was written, 'Please, please, burn this letter, and be at the gate by 10 o'clock. L.L.' The paper fell into pieces as my wife went to move it. We don't know who L.L. is, but if you could find out, you might learn more about Sir Charles's death. We haven't told anyone else. We felt it would not be good for poor, kind Sir Charles. But we thought we ought to tell you, Sir Henry."
The Barrymores left us, and Sir Henry turned to me.
"If we can find L.L., the mystery may be at an end," he said. "What do you think we should do, Watson?"
"I must write to Holmes at once," I said, and I went straight to my room and wrote a letter to Holmes, which gave him all the details of Barrymore's story. On the following day, heavy rain fell without stopping. I put on my coat and went for a long walk on the moor. I thought of Selden out on the cold moor in this weather. And I thought of the other man, the mysterious watcher. As I walked, Dr. Mortimer drove past me. He stopped and said he would take me back to the hall. "I expect you know almost everybody living near here," I said. "Do you know a woman whose names begin with the letters L.L.? Dr. Mortimer thought for a minute, and then he said, "Yes, Mrs. Laura Lyons. She lives in Newtown." "Who is she?" I asked. "She's Mr. Frankland's daughter." "What, old Frankland, who has the large telescope?" "Yes," said Dr. Mortimer. "Laura married a painter called Lyons, who came to paint pictures of the moor. But he was cruel to her, and after a while he left her. Her father will not speak to her because she married against his wishes. So her husband and her father have made her life very unhappy." "How does she live?" I asked. "Several people who knew her sad story have helped her. Stapleton and Sir Charles gave her some money. I gave a little myself. She used the money to start a typewriting business." Dr. Mortimer wanted to know why I was asking about Mrs. Lyons. However, I preferred to keep the reason secret, and we talked about other things for the rest of the journey. Only one other thing of interest happened that day. In the evening after dinner, I had a few words with Barrymore alone. I asked him whether Selden had left the country. "I don't know, sir," Barrymore replied. "I hope he is gone, but I've not heard anything of him since I last left food and some clothes for him, and that was 3 days ago." "Did you see him then?" "No, sir, but the food and clothes were gone when I next went that way," Barrymore told me. "Then Selden was certainly there?" I asked. "I think so, sir, unless the other man took everything." I sat very still and looked hard at Barrymore. "You know there is another man, then? Have you seen him?" "No, sir, but Selden told me about him a week or more ago. He is hiding from someone, too, but he is not an escaped prisoner." "I don't like it, sir. Something evil is going to happen, I'm sure. Sir Henry would be much safer in London." "Did Selden tell you anything more about the other man?" I asked. "He looked like a gentleman. He was living in one of the old stone huts on the moor. A boy works for him and brings him all the food and things he needs. That's all Selden told me." I thanked him, and he left me. I went to the window and looked out at the rain and the clouds. It was a wild night. I knew the huts Barrymore had spoken about. There were many of them on the moor. They had been built many hundreds of years ago by the people who lived on the moor. They would not keep a man warm and dry in bad weather. Selden could not choose to live anywhere else. But why did the other man live in such conditions? I sat and thought what I should do next. I decided I must try to find the man who had been watching us. Was he the enemy who had been following us since the very beginning in London? If he was, and I could catch him, perhaps our difficulties would be at an end. I also decided to hunt the man on my own. Sir Henry was still shaken by the terrible cry we had heard on the moor. I did not want to add to his troubles, or to lead him into more danger. Chapter 11. Laura Lyons. I told Sir Henry about Laura Lyons, and that I wanted to speak to her as soon as possible. Then I went to her house in Newtown. A maid took me into the sitting-room, where a very pretty lady with dark hair was working at a typewriter. I told her who I was, and that I had met her father. "I have no contact with my father," she said. "He gave me no help when I was in trouble. Sir Charles Baskerville and some other kind people helped me when I was poor and hungry." "It is about Sir Charles that I have come to see you," I said. "I want to know if you ever wrote to him and asked him to meet you." She looked very angry, and her face went white. "What a question!" she said. "What right have you to ask me about my private life? But the answer is no." "Surely you are not remembering clearly," I said. "I think you wrote to him on the day that he died. And your letter said, 'Please, please, burn this letter, and be at the gate by 10 o'clock. For a moment I thought she was going to faint. Then she said in a low voice, "I asked Sir Charles to tell nobody." "You must not think that Sir Charles spoke to anyone about you," I said. "He put the letter on the fire, but not all of it was burnt. Now, did you write that letter to him?" "Yes," she said. "Why should I be ashamed of writing to him? I wanted him to help me. I learned that he was going to London early on the following day, so I asked him to meet me before he went. I could not go to the hall earlier that day." "But why did you ask him to meet you in the garden instead of in the house?" I asked. "Do you think it would be sensible for a woman to go at that time of night into the house of an unmarried man?" she asked. "Well, what happened when you got there?" I asked. "I didn't go," she replied. "Mrs. Lyons!" "I tell you, I did not go. Something happened that stopped me from going. I can't tell you what it was." "Mrs. Lyons," I said, "if you did not see Sir Charles, you must tell me why. If you do not, it will look very bad for you if I have to go to the police with this new piece of information about the letter." Mrs. Lyons thought for a moment, and then she said, "I see that I must tell you. Perhaps you know that I married a man who was very cruel to me. I hate him, and I wanted to get a divorce. But a divorce is expensive, and I had no money. I thought that if Sir Charles heard my sad story, he would help me to get a divorce." "Then why didn't you go to see Sir Charles?" I asked her. "Because I got help from someone else," she said. "Why didn't you write to Sir Charles and tell him?" "I was going to, but I saw in the newspaper the next morning that he had died." I asked Mrs. Lyons a number of other questions, but she did not change her story, whatever I asked her. I was sure that she was telling the truth. I could check two important parts of the story. If they were right, there could be no doubt that she was telling the truth. I could check that she had begun to get her divorce at about the time of Sir Charles's death. I could also check that she had not been to Baskerville Hall on the night of Sir Charles's death. But I was not sure that she had told me the whole truth. Why had she nearly fainted when I had told her about the letter? That was not completely explained by the story she had told me. I had discovered all I could for the moment. I left her, and went to search for more information in a different place. Chapter 12. The Man on the Moor. I drove out of Newtown and went to begin my search for the mysterious man on the moor. There were hundreds of the old stone huts on the moor. Barrymore did not know in which of them the mysterious man was living. I had seen the man on the night when Sir Henry and I had chased Selden, so I decided to start my search near that place. The path I took ran past Mr. Franklin's house, and I saw him standing at his gate. He called to me and invited me to go in and have a drink with him. He had been arguing with the police and was angry with them. He began to tell me about it. "But they will be sorry," he said. "I could tell them where to look for the escaped prisoner, but I'm not going to help them. You see, I have been searching the moors with my telescope, and although I have not actually seen the prisoner, I have seen the person who is taking him food." I thought of Barrymore and Mrs. Barrymore's worried face, but Mr. Franklin's next words showed me that I did not need to worry. "You will be surprised to hear that a young boy takes food to the prisoner. The boy goes by at about the same time each day, and he's always carrying a bag. Who else can he be going to see except the prisoner? Come and look through my telescope, and you will see that I am right. It is about this time each day that the boy goes by." We went up onto the roof, and we did not have to wait long. There was someone moving on a hill in front of the house. I looked through the telescope and saw a small boy with a bag over his shoulder. He looked round to make sure that nobody was following him, and then he disappeared over the hill.
"Remember that I don't want the police to know my secret, Dr. Watson," Franklin reminded me. "I'm too angry with them at the moment to help them."
I agreed not to tell the police, and said goodbye. I walked along the road while Franklin was watching me, but as soon as I was round the corner, I went towards the hill where we had seen the boy. The sun was already going down when I reached the top of the hill. I could not see the boy, and there was nothing else in that lonely place. Beneath me, on the other side of the hill, was a circle of old stone huts. In the middle of the circle was one hut that had a better roof than the others, so it would keep out the wind and the rain. This must be the place where the mysterious man was hiding. I would soon know his secret. As I walked towards the hut, I saw that someone had certainly been using it. A path had been worn up to the door. I took my revolver out of my pocket and checked that it was ready to fire. I walked quickly and quietly up to the hut and looked inside. The place was empty, but this was certainly where the man lived. As I looked round the hut, I knew that the mysterious man must have a very strong character. No other person could live in conditions as bad as these. There were some blankets on a flat stone where the man slept. There had been a fire in one corner. There were some cooking pots and a large bowl half full of water. In the middle of the hut was another large flat stone, which was used as a table, and on it was the bag the boy had been carrying. Under the bag I saw a piece of paper with writing on it. Quickly I picked up the paper and read what was written on it. It said, "Dr. Watson has gone to Newtown." I realized that the mysterious man had told someone to watch me, and this was a message from his spy. Was the man a dangerous enemy? Or was he a friend who was watching us to make sure we were safe? I decided I would not leave the hut until I knew. Outside, the sun was low in the sky. Everything looked calm and peaceful in the golden evening light. But I did not feel peaceful or calm. I felt frightened as I waited for the mysterious man. Then I heard footsteps coming towards the hut. As they came closer, I moved into the darkest corner of the hut. I did not want the man to see me until I had looked closely at him. The footsteps stopped, and I could hear nothing at all. Then the man began to move again, and the footsteps came closer. A shadow fell across the door of the hut.
"It's a lovely evening, my dear Watson," said a voice I knew well. "I really think you will enjoy it more out here."
Chapter 13. Too Late. For a moment or two I could neither breathe nor move. Then I felt my fear and unhappiness disappear, as I knew that I was no longer alone in my responsibility for Sir Henry. The dangers all around me did not seem so frightening. The cool voice could belong to only one man in the world. "Holmes!" I cried. "Holmes!" I went outside the hut, and there was Holmes. He was sitting on a stone, and his grey eyes were dancing with amusement. He was thin and worn, but bright and wide awake. His skin was brown from the wind and the sun, but his chin was smooth, and his shirt was white. He did not look like a man who had been living in the middle of the moor. "I have never been so glad to see anyone in my life," I said, "nor so surprised." "I am surprised too," Holmes said, as he shook me warmly by the hand. "How did you find me?" I told him about Frankland, and how I had seen the boy with the food. Holmes went into the hut and looked at the food, and at the note with it. "I guess that you have been to see Mrs. Laura Lyons," he said. And when I told him that he was right, he went on, "When we put together everything that each of us has discovered, I expect we shall know almost everything about this case." "But how did you get here?" I asked him. "And what have you been doing? I thought you had to finish your case in London."
"That is what I wanted you to think," he said.
"Then you have tricked me, and have no confidence in me," I said. I was upset and angry because he had not told me his plans.
"I am sorry if it seems I have tricked you, my dear Watson. I did not want our enemy to know I was here, but I wanted to be near enough to make sure that you and Sir Henry were safe. You are a kind person, too kind to leave me alone out here in bad weather. Our enemy would guess I was here if he saw you coming out with food, or with important news. You have been a very real help to me. Your letters with all their valuable information have been brought to me. You have done excellent work, and without you I would not have all the important details I needed."
Holmes's warm words of thanks made me feel much happier, and I saw that he was right.
"That's better,"
he said, as he saw the shadow lift from my face.
"Now, tell me about your visit to Mrs. Laura Lyons."
I told Holmes everything Mrs. Lyons had said.
"This is all